The use of sexual violence by Israeli soldiers and settlers has been thrown into the spotlight after a New York Times column brought long-term claims into the mainstream US media. Critics have accused the Times of framing individual abuses as a systemic Israeli problem. We'll get onto the information war breaking out online. But first, let's examine that distinction: isolated incidents or a pattern of abuse. The Times reporter Nicholas Kristoff bases his report on interviews with 14 men and women, many corroborated by secondary sources. He notes there is no evidence that Israeli leaders order rapes and says it's impossible to know how common sexual assaults against Palestinians are. But he quotes, among others, a US-Israeli lawyer describing persistent evidence that the authorities know it's happening and are not stopping it. Kristoff also cites a UN report calling sexual violence standard operating procedure for Israel, a Save the Children survey in which minors aged 12 to 17 said that they had witnessed or experienced sexual violence in Israeli detention, a report by Breaking the Silence, which is run by former Israeli soldiers, in which one ex-prison officer said his peers abused for their own amusement. There's also a report by Israeli human rights groups, Beit Salem, calling the Israeli prison system a network of torture camps and specifying sexual torture. Also, a survey of detained journalists by the Committee to Protect Journalists. There are more. Last month, researchers for the West Bank Protection Consortium published 16 cases of conflict-related sexual violence by Israeli soldiers and settlers in the West Bank. It said this violence is habitually used to force Palestinians out of their homes. If true, it would expand the picture of sexual abuse emerging from Israeli prisons across the machinery of Israel's occupation. The Ramallah-based Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling has also documented the use of sexual violence against Palestinian women and girls. Their advocacy unit manager, Kifaya Khraim, joins us now. Kifaya, welcome to MEE Live, albeit to discuss a very difficult topic. Please could you share with us the nature of sexual violence that you have documented, to what end it was being used, and by whom?
Thank you for having me. Ever since I started working at the Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling, which is a feminist organization, Palestinian feminist organization based in Ramallah here, we have been documenting sexual violence being systematically used by Israeli soldiers and by Israeli settlers, and in many cases in Jerusalem by Israeli police officers against Palestinian women and girls. We have seen sexual violence happen systematically at detention centers. We have interviewed a lot of women, tens of women who been into the Israeli detention system and out, and we have interviewed them, ensured their anonymity so they wouldn't be retaliated against, and all of them said the same thing over and over again. There were sexual assaults, there were instances of rape. We had documented 3 cases of which there was rape by Israeli soldiers. We have also documented how threats of rape and sexual assault, forced nudity that is not being used for search purposes, women would be getting naked and in front of each other and then being pushed on top of each other in many instances, and women being forced to watch sexual violence as it happened to other women. This has led us to the belief that it was systematic because it happened in different detention facilities like in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem. These women were being handled by different, let's say, police officers or military brigades, and it has resulted into the conclusion that it was systematic. Even in Jerusalem, we had cases in which a woman was detained in a police station and then she was forced to undress and then beaten on her genitals. We have similar testimonies from different areas. This is in detention centers, but there's another topic that is not really talked about much, is sexual violence by settlers. It's whenever we have pogroms on villages in Area C, and then they start trying to sexually assault women, say things of profanities and sexual nature that has deterred so many women and girls from accessing education and whatnot. We also talk about sexual violence on checkpoints, which is very, very common here in the West Bank. We have also seen that in Gaza when women evacuated from the north to the south through the Netzarim checkpoint. We saw how Israeli soldiers used sexual violence and assault systematically.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive. I was going to ask, how do we define something as systematic and not as isolated incidents? You say it's happening in different centres. I suppose there are also patterns emerging in the incidents that link them together. And as you paint, also, you cover quite detailed, this is not just happening inside Israeli prisons, which is something we have documented here on MEE Live. We've actually played very harrowing first-hand testimonies of this happening inside detention centres. Your findings expand this alleged violence beyond those walls to checkpoints. Just how far into daily Palestinian life does this issue of sexual violence by their occupying power, how far into their daily life does it reach?
I can confidently say that it happens every day. It is so common that it's deterring a lot of girls and women to commute. We have seen this in Hebron, for example, where checkpoints, and in Jerusalem as well, where most of the checkpoints are closed structures in which women and girls access and they're not visible to the public. So we have documentations in which Israeli soldiers took chance and they, for example, we have testimonies of one specific soldier in one area exposing his genitals to schoolgirls. We have similar testimonies in areas like Jerusalem, similarly schoolgirls commuting to schools and then having armed Israeli soldiers sexually assault them, pretending to be searching them, and they would molest them, touch their genitals and touch their breasts in many areas of Jerusalem and Hebron as well. Similarly, in Gaza, whenever the evacuations happened, we have seen this happen where Israeli soldiers knew that women would be carrying the jewelry or the money and the expensive stuff because of how usually men are more targeted for detention. They knew of that, so they started looting women, and they would be searching their undergarments, touching them and molesting them, assaulting them in the process. It is so common. It is used as a tool to humiliate, to degrade, to dominate Palestinians in these areas. And also it's some sort of a sexual terrorism in a way. People in communities are terrified from commuting to schools, commuting to education, commuting even to work. And it also gets also to men and boys as well. But our organization only documents cases with women and girls. We have one instance in which a woman has like a heart pacemaker and she was trying to pass through a checkpoint. She showed the documents that she carries all the time to say to the soldier that I cannot pass through the gate. And for that, 3 male soldiers started touching her and assaulting her, saying that we need to search you, we need to make sure you're not carrying anything. And she was screaming and yelling, but no one could access the checkpoint. And this is so common. And when maybe we can talk about the challenges that makes women terrified of speaking to us, to human rights organizations and or media.
This is all very, very shocking to hear. When this is publicized, Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, instantly has dismissed claims of abuse by Israeli soldiers as blood libel. Can you tell us, have Israeli authorities made any credible attempts to investigate these reports of abuse committed by people in their employment?
We don't believe so. First of all, people, like even the victims, they don't believe in that system because we know that there's a 0 conviction rate in Israeli system. We haven't seen any soldiers or any settlers being held accountable for sexual violence. And speaking after the genocide and all of these atrocities and war crimes that have been committed and documented, the victims don't have faith in that system that kills people like the way it was happening in Gaza and in the West Bank as well. We also see the Sedati Man incident being filmed and then being broadcasted on Israeli TV and not seeing any sort of accountability. What we see is the complete opposite. So much impunity, so much lack of accountability that Israeli soldiers are now filming their crimes often and they publish it online under their own names. So we don't see any sort of accountability happening within the Israeli system.
Is this an escalation? Like, are you able to identify when this became a systemic issue and whether any specific incidents or individuals or factors help to explain that escalation?
I would say that ever since the election of the most right-wing Israeli government in 2022, we have seen escalation in killings and home invasions. Even though we didn't touch up on that, in which Israeli soldiers invade Palestinian homes, usually what we documented is a pattern that they would invade these houses after 2 a.m. in the morning. We see sexual violence happening in Palestinian homes, and that's the first thing we started to document and noted, and that was in July 2023. Following October 7th, we have seen this pattern increasing over and over again. We see women coming out of detention centers talking more about it, and it made women more comfortable to share their experiences of sexual violence, especially in detention centers. But yes, we can say that it has incredibly increased, and with the lack of immunity, and lack of accountability, it's increasing more and more.
This is one reason why it is so important for news outlets, international news outlets, to cover, because, as you say, there is it helps to break the stigma and it helps to encourage more people to explain what has happened to them and therefore to get a real picture of what's going on. Now, this issue is only just really starting to attract mainstream Western news attention. Why has the issue of sexual violence in Israeli jails taken so long to come out internationally?
It's beyond me. We have been saying this over and over again. Other human rights organizations have been saying this over and over again. We have a report published by the Commission of Inquiry on Palestine being published in March 2025 saying the same thing. We believe sexual violence is systematic and it's being used as a tool of torture and degradation in Israeli detention centers. It's beyond me why it's getting attention of the media now, like New York Times, for example, to be honest, because we have been trying to flag this for the past 3 years. Many media outlets, even B'Tselem, have documented this in July 2023 when they documented that incident in Hebron where Israeli soldiers invaded a house and they forced the women of that family to get naked and be naked in front of their family members. We have, as a Palestinian human rights organization, have been flagging this for over 3 years, and we haven't seen any sort of media reporting heavily on this, except for some outlets that are, like, in some way or another pro-human rights.
There are many, many reports that have actually received no coverage here in the Western mainstream media. One thing that is noticeable is that most of the testimonies given are anonymous. How real is the threat of retribution by Israeli authorities against victims for speaking out?
It is the most real thing. We have documented so many instances in which women get released out of detention centers and then they get threatened on their way out. If you talk about this to the media, you're going back in there. Nobody wants to go back into Israeli detention centers. In one case, we have documented a couple has been taken together to Israeli detention centers. They were tortured. The woman talked to us. She said that this happened to me. They sexually assaulted me in front of my husband. They tried to touch me. One of them took off their bands and they said things of sexual nature in front of her husband to humiliate him. They were released after a week, but then she went out to the media and she didn't even talk about sexual violence. She talked about her experience being in detention. She got a phone call from a commander in the Israeli army saying, if you go to the media again, we know where to find you. This is more common than you think. We have Facebook pages being run by Israeli commanders threatening people of the communities. We have one specific woman who's a prominent, she was sharing a lot of things about human rights violations on the media. She got threatened with her family members in detention. So they said, if you go to the media about this, we still have your father. We can kill your father in Israeli detention centers and nobody's going to say anything about it. And we have seen how in the past 3 years, we have over 100 Palestinian prisoners die of starvation and torture in Israeli detention centers. One of the things also is we have a lot of changing laws in the Israeli Knesset being implemented, trying to retaliate against any organizations and any journalists who speak of this, even within the Israeli system itself. We have the judges of the ICC being punished by the United States for having a case against Israel. So you can imagine if the International Criminal Court is being punished like that. So imagine like Palestinians living within the Palestinian territories and they have no means of protection. Of course, they're terrified of speaking. And the thing we do at the Women's Center is we try to ensure their anonymity. We try to give them this protection and safety. We're not going to give out any information that might give your identity. And that's why we get more documentation and more testimonies.
Kifaya Khraim, thank you for your time. Overdue it may be, but Palestinian testimonies have now made the New York Times. So Netanyahu says he's suing the New York Times. The Israeli Prime Minister threatened the harshest legal action against the outlet and its journalist, Nicholas Kristoff. Whatever for.
I went to the West Bank to talk with Palestinians who experienced sexual assault firsthand by Israeli soldiers, settlers, and prison guards.
The New York Times said Netanyahu's legal claim would be without merit. And it has a point. The Times was careful. It classified the piece controversially as an opinion. That's despite it being based on 14 testimonies, many of them corroborated. And so Netanyahu's threat remains just that, a threat. But while it has not yet launched a legal trial, it immediately launched an internet one with a far lower threshold for actual evidence. And perhaps that was exactly the goal.
Yep. You heard that right. The New York Times, the one-time paper of record, the definitive legacy newspaper of this country, published an outright fabrication that Israelis had somehow overcome the laws of nature and taught dogs to rape Palestinians. It's astonishing that this needs to be said, but Jews trained dogs to rape prisoners is an IQ test, and if you believe it, you just failed.
The account behind this clip was previously exposed by BBC News for pretending to be Mossad itself. It now poses as a news site, despite once publishing a video game excerpt as real footage from the war in Gaza. Another X-account posing as an independent media watchdog finds Kristoff guilty of journalistic malpractice. The account, which is called Honest Reporting and has 1 million followers, then attacks not just Kristoff, but the alleged rape survivors themselves. It rejects one victim's claim of being unfairly imprisoned, stating he was actually jailed for incitement. But the speaker was imprisoned without charge for 16 months. Under its own laws, even Israel doesn't need to give reason for imprisonment, so this fact-checker certainly does not. The account then claims the victim must be lying because he remembers details of his rape that were missing from an earlier testimony. The account says these are not the kind of details victims somehow forget. In fact, specialists say this is exactly how sexual trauma works. Victims suffer memory gaps in the aftermaths, with details returning months later. Finally, the account Honest Reporting dismisses testimonies of rape involving objects and animals on the grounds they are bizarre. Bizarre violence is called sadism, and it is not alleged victims who should be shamed for it. These men's testimonies are consistent with countless others, including ones collected by MEE.
هذا اللي بيخرف فيي اغتصبوا كلب بعيد عنك. كلب بشكل مباشر اغتصبه.
بتفاجئ الكلب انه بيركبني ويبدأ بمجامعتي كمجامعة أنثى من جنسه. شعرت بعضو الكلب وهو يلامس جسمي، وشعرت في ايديه وهن ماسكت لي من ظهري.
UN report documenting Israel's systemic use of sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence. Israeli human rights group B'Tselem has literally collated a collage out of testimonies, and CCTV from Israel's own prison, leaked by one of Israel's own lawyers, showed prison guards allegedly sexually abusing a prisoner. This abuse has been public information for months. Yet the online anger is not about sexual violence against Palestinians. It's about the fact the Times dared to publish it. Joining me now is presenter of Double Down Newswatch, Richard Sanders. Richard, welcome back to MEE Live. The New York Times is facing a backlash for publishing Palestinian testimonials of rape by Israeli soldiers. What do you think is behind the outrage?
Well, they feel they need to discredit these accounts. There is such an enormous volume of these accounts out there now. You know, I originally reported on this in our film Gaza for Al Jazeera's investigative unit, which came out in October 2024. There's a mountain of evidence has come out since then. UN reports, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, B'Tselem, and so on. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming, and they're absolutely determined to turn the narrative. They will always bring up sexual violence. On October the 7th, the Israelis produced their own report in the last week or so. The difference, I said this on Double Down Newswatch, the difference in the standards of proof required of Palestinians and Israelis is absolutely staggering. Sexual violence on October the 7th is an absolute article of faith in Western media. It's taken as given. If you actually do the journalism and look into it, it's extraordinary how thin the evidence is, particularly when compared with, as I say, this grotesque mountain of evidence of sexual violence operating the other way.
Let's dive into those specific sort of details, or the two sides of evidence that you're weighing up. So on the one hand, I can definitely agree. In many ways, the coverage was overdue. We've just detailed a number of reports containing similar evidence from organisations that Western news outlets normally respect, like the UN, and these date back over a year. Richard, you've monitored Western headlines for the duration of the period. How much coverage has sexual violence against Palestinians actually been given?
Well, it's dwarfed by comparison with the coverage of supposed sexual violence on October the 7th. Absolutely dwarfed. I mean, it's not that they haven't reported it. It has begun to be reported. It has begun to seep into the mainstream, particularly, you know, when the United Nations, Francesca Albanese and other people and Amnesty, B'Tselem are reporting it. They can't simply ignore it. But it really is. It's underplayed when you consider how grotesque it is, and conditions generally in Israeli detention centers are absolutely unimaginably barbaric. And certainly the coverage is not sufficient that there is now a sort of body of steam building up to force political action. It's still quite extraordinary the degree to which Western governments are not pressuring the Israelis on the subject of conditions in their detention centers.
Yeah.
I mean, what we focused on in the Gaza film, and also we did recently on Double Down News Watch, is this horrific practice of using dogs to rape inmates. Now, just to quickly deal with something here, the pushback here, and you played a clip earlier, is that this is anatomically impossible. You can't train dogs to do this. I would say to people, just look back at the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. It is absolutely well documented that dogs were trained to do precisely this during that period.
Something that really struck me about the backlash to this is that the horrifying nature of the claim is actually being used to discredit the claim and to frame it as inherently anti-Semitic, even though the claim is not Jews trained dogs, it's Israeli prison guards. But I suppose this feels like a trap for survivors speaking out. It's basically saying that the more unacceptable the abuse, the more unacceptable it is to say it publicly. And it's also a very aggressive line of attack to take against possible victims of something really horrific. When you look at this backlash happening online, do you think it's fair to say that this is a coordinated information war? In other words, this is propaganda. Or do you think this is genuine grassroots rage?
Oh, I mean, of course it's coordinated. It's very much coordinated. I think they're often able to tap into, though, genuine grassroots rage. I think the West does have this blind spot about Israel. I think the accusation of anti-Semitism, even now, even after the genocide, still resonates. I think some people who take up the cry and echo it are doing it. They're in good faith. They're wrong, but I don't think they think that they're lying. But I think, yes, it's very much driven by the Israeli government and by Israeli lobbying groups around the world. And as you said, it's an extraordinary line of argument. You know, this is so unthinkably appalling, it can't possibly be true. Well, you know, I'm afraid it is true.
Now, you also point out that the day after the New York Times article was published, an Israeli report came out on sexual crimes allegedly committed on October the 7th. This was published also in the New York Times, the CNN, in the BBC, many other Western outlets as well. This report was by a group called the Civil Commission. So the BBC credits this report as one made by an independent organization. The New York Times notably did not say that this was an independent report. They said it was an Israeli report. The BBC did. On what grounds does the BBC identify this as an independent investigation?
God only knows. You'd have to ask them. I mean, it's actually the second word in the report, isn't it? It's quite extraordinary, the BBC's report. This. When I came in and chatted to Peter Oborn at Middle East Eye, when we did our first film at Al Jazeera's investigative unit, October 7, and I pointed out a piece they'd done in the beginning of December, where they will cite the most extraordinarily compromised sources as if they have complete authority. It's just bewildering how experienced, skilled journalists can do this sort of thing. Now, with, you know, on Double Down News Watch, we pointed out just very basic problems with this report. The woman who's behind it, Kochav El-Chaim Levy, was comprehensively discredited in Israeli media 2 years ago. She has this fellow Rami Davidian as one of her key sources, who again is discredited. I mean, he wasn't even there. He just made it all up, according to Israel's Channel 13, at least. And then, you know, again, if this, for a professional journalist, doesn't set alarm bells ringing, the evidence it is all based on is in a closed archive. Now, this is supposedly to protect the privacy of the victims and so on. The Israelis, when they were trying to combat the South African case against the ICJ, produced a website where they put the most appalling, graphic, horrific photos of the aftermath of October the 7th. Now, it wasn't available within Israel, but it was available outside of Israel. The idea that they're concerned about the privacy of the victims it just doesn't wash. So, really, if you're a professional journalist and someone says, "Just trust me," you can't look at the archive. Just trust me.
And
You're going to support that, particularly given the track record over decades of the Israelis just brazenly lying about these things.
yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I don't want to fall into the trap of criticizing, accounts and individuals who would just automatically seek to discredit victims of sexual abuse and then go and do the opposite. But as you point out, there is a context here that is relevant. There is a history of severe lies being not just told, but used to justify what we have seen to be a genocidal war over years. And these are, what you just point out, the closed nature of the archives. These fail to present a problem to media who, by any journalistic standards, should be seriously confronted by that. The BBC in its report also says, while the UN and others have published reports, this is the most comprehensive. Well, there's a reason this is more comprehensive than the UN report, and that is that Israel has not allowed independent UN fact-finders in the region to investigate, along with other independent, or at least external groups like Human Rights Watch. They have not been allowed to put together their own investigation into what happened on October 7th. It is very, very difficult territory to enter, right? In any way trying to question claims of sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th. You have entered this territory. You did so with Al Jazeera in an in-depth investigative report. Why did you do that? And what did you manage to establish?
We did it because it is used again and again and again to justify the genocide. There are two things that they wheeled out again and again and again whenever they had to justify the savagery of the Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip. The murder of babies, beheading of babies, etc., which was entirely untrue, and sexual violence. So it's enormously important because it's used to whip up the hysteria that generates that. Very important point you raised there, but I just want to address listening to women and listening to victims, which I think, in general terms, is an extremely important principle. There is a woman, an Israeli woman who was a hostage, who gave an interview to the New York Times about a sexual assault she suffered while in captivity. I see absolutely no reason to disbelieve this woman. It's a perfectly clear, coherent account. It seems to me absolutely believable. She's in a situation where she's a lone female prisoner being guarded by a lone male guard, which is a situation ripe for abuse. One of the many, many problems with the accounts of sexual violence on October the 7th is there are no accounts like this. There are no identifiable victims. Now, the Israelis would turn around and say, well, they're dead, of course. How can they dead? Which might be true. It might be true. But they've never actually connected any other supposed witness accounts with a victim. There's no names attached to any of these victims, either as victims or perpetrators. So while, I obviously agree with the principle that the default should always be that you believe victims, you believe women who say they've been sexually assaulted. There are just incredible, well, there aren't any accounts like that from October the 7th. And there's no, even if victims are dead, there's no direct correlation between them and the supposed accounts. So I think that's a very important point. Now, with October the 7th, what we did with the film was we concluded that widespread systematic abuse simply didn't happen. There is simply no evidence. We were quite cautious in that, and others, and I think the Times in London eventually reached the same conclusion. And now, if you were to present to me solid evidence of sexual abuse or rape happening on October the 7th, I'd say, I accept that. Many crimes were committed on October the 7th. In our film, October 7th, we're quite clear about that. There are widespread violations of human rights. Many more crimes are committed on October the 7th. I've simply never seen a concrete example of sexual crimes being committed. But given what else was happening that day, it's perfectly conceivable it could have happened. The Israelis have just never presented solid proof.
And indeed, that was the conclusion of the UN special representative on sexual violence and conflict. The conclusion was that there are reasonable grounds to believe incidents of sexual violence did occur on October 7th, but many of the testimonies given as proof in the immediate aftermath by the media were falsified. At worst, completely falsified, and in most cases unsubstantiated. And this, of course, formed the basis of justification for invasion.
what you have an awful lot, the vast bulk of the evidence is the post-mortem conditions of the bodies. Okay, it's people seeing bodies and saying it looks as if this had happened to them. One, that is a notoriously unreliable way of working out what had happened to someone immediately before they died. You know, post-mortem examination of a body is, well, I mean, unless you're doing it in a lab and you're a professional and so on. Frequently, this was being done by people who had no forensic training at all. Frequently, people who, you know, who because of their accounts about babies and so on, were not necessarily to be believed. So the core of the evidence is extremely questionable. Any expert in this area will say to you that's an extremely unreliable basis of evidence.
Now, just before we wrap this segment, I am curious about your thoughts. Netanyahu has threatened to sue the New York Times and the reporter Nicholas Kristoff. So far, this remains a threat only. I suppose, if I'm honest, my analysis would be I don't think this is a real legal threat. Maybe I'll be disproven. But what it did was open the floodgates for an information war. Do you think that we will see this legal threat become a reality?
I certainly hope so. They'd be very, very foolish this examined in court. I would love to see this all being played out in an American courtroom. Just one thing as well to sort of finish on a positive note. You know, the New York Times hasn't always been great on Israel. It did publish this piece and it's sticking by its guns. Okay, it's under massive pressure and so far it's holding its nerve. And I think that's quite a significant change that should be noted.
Richard Sanders, thank you for your time.